pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to f3, pawn to c5, pawn to e3, pawn to d5, pawn to d5, pawn to d5, bishop to b5, bishop to d7, bishop to d7, queen to d7, king to g1, knight to c6, pawn to b3, pawn to d4, knight to d4, knight to d4, queen to d4, bishop to d6, bishop to b2, king to g8, knight to c3, rook to e8, knight to d5, bishop to h2, king to h2, queen to d5, queen to d5, knight to d5, rook to d1, rook to d8, rook to c1, pawn to f6, rook to d4, knight to e7, rook to c7, knight to f5, rook to g4, pawn to h5, rook to g6, rook to e8, bishop to f6, rook to e6, pawn to e4, rook to e4, rook to g5, rook to h4, king to g1, rook to e8, pawn to g3, rook to g4, rook to f5, pawn to f6, rook to b7, pawn to h4, rook to f4, rook to f4, pawn to f4, rook to a8, king to g2, pawn to a5, king to h3, pawn to a4, king to h4, pawn to b3, pawn to b3, rook to a5, king to g4, rook to d5, pawn to b4, king to f8, pawn to b5, king to e8, pawn to f5, king to f8, pawn to b6, rook to b5, pawn to f3, king to e8, pawn to f4, king to f8, king to h5, rook to f5, king to g6, rook to f4, rook to c7,